Grease doesn't wash off. It just settles deeper into the cracks of your skin. Thomas knew that better than anyone. He was $50 short on rent and tired of being the punchline for guys in suits. Then, a terrified teenager dragged a shredded tire into his dying shop at midnight. He changed it for free. He figured that was the end of it, until the morning when a black Maybach blocked his bay doors, and a woman who owned half the city stepped into his oil-stained reality. The air inside Wade's auto always tasted like copper and old dust. It was a suffocating mix of aerosol brake cleaner, oxidized metal, and the lingering ghost of burnt coffee. Thomas Wade lay on his creeper, staring up at the rusted underbelly of a 2012 Honda Civic. A drop of dirty condensation fell from the oil pan, landing dead center on his cheekbone. He didn't blink. He just wiped it away with the back of a hand that looked like it had been wrapped in coarse sandpaper. He wrenched the socket wrench. His knuckles scraped against the exhaust pipe. A thin line of blood welled up bright red against the heavy black grime coating his skin. "Damn it," he muttered. Just a sharp exhale of breath. He sucked on the cut, the metallic taste familiar, and rolled himself out from under the chassis. The shop was quiet, save for the hum of the space heater in the corner office. Through the smeared plexiglass window, Thomas could see his 8-year-old son, Ben. The boy was hunched over a math worksheet, his small fingers gripping a yellow pencil too tightly. He was wearing 2 sweaters. Thomas hadn't been able to afford the heating oil for the shop's main furnace this month. The bell above the bay door jingled. A man in a slate-grey wool overcoat walked in his Italian leather loafers, stepping gingerly around a puddle of dried coolant. He looked around the shop with a tight, pinched expression, as if simply inhaling the air here might lower his credit score. He was holding the keys to the BMW that Thomas had patched a tire on an hour ago. "You finished?" the man asked. His name was Greg. Thomas knew this because Greg had spent the first 10 minutes of their interaction complaining loudly on his phone about a merger. "It's done," Thomas said. He grabbed a blue shop towel and wiped his hands, though it did nothing but move the grease around. "Found a 2-inch nail in the tread. Patched it from the inside. Rebalanced." Greg didn't look at Thomas. He looked at the grease on Thomas's shirt, then at the grimy credit card terminal on the counter. "How much?" "$40. Greg pulled a leather money clip from his pocket. He extracted 2 crisp $20 bills. He held them out, but as Thomas reached for them, Greg let them drop onto the counter. They fluttered down, landing next to a smear of differential fluid. "You should really clean this place up," Greg said, his voice dripping with casual disdain. He glanced toward the office window, spotting Ben. "Or at least keep the kid somewhere else. Not exactly a great environment, is it? Unless you're training a new grease monkey." Thomas froze. His jaw tightened so hard, a dull ache shot up into his temples. A younger Thomas would have vaulted the counter. A younger Thomas would have shoved the 20s down Greg's throat and thrown him out into the freezing rain. But Thomas was 38. His ex-wife was gone, the mortgage on the shop was 3 months in arrears, and Ben needed new boots for the winter. Thomas looked at the 20s on the counter. He looked at the man's pristine loafers. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat. It tasted like failure. "Have a good night, sir," Thomas said. His voice was entirely flat. Greg scoffed, turned on his heel, and walked out. The door rattled shut. Thomas stood there for a long time, in the silence, listening to the rain pick up against the corrugated tin roof. He picked up the money. The paper was smooth. He folded it carefully and shoved it into his pocket, hating the way it felt. He walked into the office. The space heater rattled loudly. Ben looked up, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Dad, are we going home soon?" "Yeah, buddy," Thomas said, softly ruffling the boy's hair. "Just got to close the bay doors. Let's get you packed up." Thomas hated himself in that moment. He hated that he had smiled at the kid while swallowing an insult. He hated the smell of the shop. He hated that he was tired all the time. But mostly, he hated the creeping realization that the men in the suits were right. He was drowning, and he was pulling his son down with him. It was past 10 o'clock. Ben had fallen asleep on the ratty-plaid couch in the office, his jacket pulled up over his ears. The rain had turned into a steady, freezing downpour, turning the potholes in the shop's lot into dark, reflective pools. Thomas was pulling the heavy chain to lower the main bay door when he heard it. Screech! It was the agonizing, unmistakable sound of raw aluminum grinding against wet asphalt. Headlights cut through the darkness, blinding him for a second. A massive, pearl-white Range Rover limped into his lot. The front passenger tire was completely gone. Shreds of smoking rubber slapped against the wheel, well like a wet whip. The driver hit the brakes hard, and the heavy SUV shuddered to a violent stop mere inches from Thomas's gas pumps. Thomas let out a heavy sigh, dropping the chain. His boots felt like they were filled with lead. He didn't want to do this. He was off the clock. He wanted to take his kid home, drink a cheap beer, and stare at the wall until he passed out. He zipped up his canvas jacket and walked out into the rain. The freezing water instantly soaked through the collar, sending a shiver down his spine. As he approached the driver's side window, the door flew open. A teenage girl practically fell out. She couldn't have been older than 16. She was wearing a thin designer dress, shivering violently, and holding a crushed smartphone. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in thick black rivers. She was hyperventilating her chest, heaving in panic. I didn't hit anything. I swear it just blew it, just exploded. She stammered the words, tripping over each other. The tire pressure light came on, but I was on the highway, and I couldn't stop, and then it sounded like a bomb, and oh my God, my mum is going to kill me. Thomas held up a hand. Hey, breathe. She didn't listen. She looked at the destroyed rim, and a fresh sob tore from her throat. It's ruined. The whole wheel is ruined. She told me not to take this car. She told me to take the Volvo. She's going to literally skin me alive. Thomas looked at the girl. He smelled stale vape smoke and cheap vanilla body spray beneath the sharp, acrid stench of burnt rubber and scorched metal. She was shaking so hard her teeth were chattering. Look, Thomas said, his voice rough but low. It's just a rim. Metal bends. Rubber gets replaced. Nobody died. You don't know my mother. The girl choked out. She fumbled with her phone. Can you fix it? Can you put a new tire on right now? I have Apple Pay. Wait, no, my card is locked. She locked it this morning because I bought shoes. Oh my God, I have no money. She looked up at Thomas, her eyes wide, terrified, and completely pathetic. Thomas closed his eyes. The rain was running down his nose. The smart thing to do was to tell her to call a tow truck. The business thing to do was to charge her double for an emergency, after-hours call, hold the car hostage until the mum paid. He opened his eyes. He looked at the girl. She looked like a cornered rabbit. Get in the office, Thomas growled. Sit on the chair. Don't wake my kid. It's warm in there. But I can't pay you. I didn't ask you to pay me. Thomas snapped, his patience fraying. Get out of the rain before you catch pneumonia. The girl blinked, stunned, then scurried toward the glowing light of the office. Thomas walked over to the ruined wheel. The heat coming off the brakes was intense. He dragged his heavy floor jack out into the freezing rain. The water soaked through the knees of his jeans as he knelt to find the jack point under the heavy chassis. His lower back screamed in protest. Why are you doing this? He asked himself as he pumped the jack handle. For a spoiled rich kid who drove on a flat for 5 miles, he didn't have an answer. Maybe it was because he was tired of everything in the world feeling so incredibly cruel. Maybe it was because she was terrified. He ripped the ruined wheel off. It weighed a ton. He tossed it aside, the metal clanging dully against the wet pavement. He walked to the back of the Range Rover, popped the trunk, and wrestled the heavy full-size spare out from under the floorboard. His fingers were completely numb by the time he threaded the lug nuts back on. The freezing rain was relentless. He grabbed his torque wrench and tightened them down in a star pattern, leaning his entire body weight into the clicks. Click, 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 click. He lowered the jack. He shoved his wet hair out of his eyes, leaving a streak of black grease across his forehead. He dragged the jack and the ruined rim back into the shop. When he walked into the office, the girl was sitting rigid on the folding chair. She hadn't stopped shaking, but she was staring at Ben, who was snoring softly on the couch. "It's on," Thomas said. His teeth were chattering now. He grabbed a towel and aggressively dried his hair. "You have a full-size spare. It's safe to drive. Keep it under 50 miles an hour. Go straight home." The girl stood up. She looked at Thomas, really looked at him. She saw the grease on his face, the blood on his knuckles, the fact that he was soaking wet. She reached into a purse. She pulled out a heavy gold watch. "Take this," she said softly. "Please. It's worth like $3,000. I can't just take a free tire." Thomas looked at the watch. The gold glinted under the harsh fluorescent bulb. $3,000. That was 3 months of mortgage. That was Christmas for Ben. That was groceries and heat. He felt a deep, ugly hunger in his gut. He looked away. "Put it away," Thomas said, his voice hard. "I don't want your jewelry, kid. I'm a mechanic, not a pawn shop." "But," I said, "put it away." Thomas stepped back, crossing his arms. He felt defensive. He felt angry that she had offered it, and angrier that he had wanted to take it. "Just go home and tell your mum she needs to get the alignment checked. You probably bent a control arm." The girl swallowed hard. She shoved the watch back into her purse. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." She ran out into the rain. Thomas watched the taillights of the Range Rover disappear into the dark street. He locked the door, turned off the heater, and picked up his sleeping son. The kid was warm. Thomas felt cold down to his bones. The morning sun was brutally bright. It glared off the puddles in the lot and highlighted every speck of dust dancing in the air inside the shop. Thomas was drinking his 3rd cup of black coffee. It tasted like battery acid, but it was hot. Ben was at school. The shop was empty. Thomas was sweeping the floor, pushing a pile of metal shavings and dried dirt from one side of the bay to the other. At 9:15 a.m., the shadow fell over the open bay doors. Thomas stopped sweeping. It wasn't a tow truck, and it wasn't a parts delivery van. It was a black Mercedes Maybach S-Class. It rolled to a stop with absolute whisper-quiet precision. It looked absurdly out of place, like a spaceship that had landed in a landfill. The rear passenger door opened. A woman stepped out. Thomas leaned on his broom. He watched her. She was in her late 40s, wearing a tailored navy blue blazer over a crisp white silk blouse and slacks that probably cost more than Thomas's shop tools combined. Her heels clicked sharply against the cracked, oil-stained concrete. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, perfect knot. But it was her eyes that Thomas noticed first. They were pale, icy grey, and they swept over the shop, the rusted tools, the water stains on the ceiling, the pile of bald tires in the corner, with the exact same look Greg had given the place the day before. The look of an auditor, assessing value and finding zero. She stopped 10 feet from him. The smell of expensive, subtle perfume, something woody and sharp, cut right through the shop's baseline odor of gasoline and sweat. "Are you Thomas Wade?" she asked. Her voice was perfectly modulated, calm, authoritative, and entirely devoid of warmth. Yeah, Thomas said. He didn't move. He didn't offer his hand. My name is Madeline Moore. I am Catalina's mother. Thomas nodded slowly. The Range Rover. Yes. Madeline opened a black leather handbag. She didn't look at him as she spoke. She seemed to be deliberately looking at a spot on the wall behind his head. My daughter came home last night in hysterics. She told me she destroyed a $2,000 custom rim and that she pulled into a random shop in the industrial district. She was crying, Thomas said flatly. I put the spare on. Madeline pulled out a sleek, minimalist checkbook and a silver fountain pen. She also told me that her cards were frozen and that you refused collateral. She said you did the labor for free. Madeline finally locked eyes with him. Her gaze was piercing. I don't believe in free, Mr. Wade. People who offer things for free in this world are usually waiting for a much larger unspoken payment later. Thomas felt a slow, hot flush of anger crawl up his neck. He gripped the wooden handle of the broom tighter. Is that right? He asked. It is, Madeline said smoothly. She clicked the pen. I am the CEO of Moore Logistics. I deal with opportunists every day. So rather than waiting for you to realize whose car you worked on, and rather than waiting for the inevitable phone call claiming you injured your back doing the work, or threatening to go to the press about my daughter driving recklessly, I prefer to settle my ledgers immediately. She began to write. I am writing you a check for $5,000. Madeline said, her tone businesslike. This covers your after-hours labor, your silence regarding my daughter's whereabouts last night, and essentially buys my peace of mind. You will take it, and we will never speak again. She finished writing, ripped the check from the pad with a crisp, tearing sound, and held it out toward him. Thomas looked at the piece of paper. $5,000. It would solve every immediate problem he had. It would pay the mortgage. It would fix the heater. It would buy Ben winter clothes, new boots, and a dozen hot meals. It was salvation, and it felt like a spit in the face. He looked from the check to Madeline Moore's perfectly manicured fingers, then up to her cold, expectant eyes. She wasn't looking at a person. She was looking at a liability she was paying to make disappear. Thomas slowly let go of the broom. It clattered to the floor. He took 2 steps forward, closing the distance between them. Madeline didn't flinch, but her eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't take the check. Keep your money, lady, Thomas said. His voice was dangerously quiet, rumbling deep in his chest. Madeline frowned, a tiny crack in her polished veneer. Excuse me if you think you can negotiate for more. I don't want your money, Thomas interrupted, stepping closer. The smell of his sweat and grease clashed violently with her perfume. I put a spare tire on a car because your kid was shivering in the freezing rain, hyperventilating, and terrified that her own mother was going to skin her alive over a piece of bent metal. Madeline's posture stiffened. How dare you? No, how dare you? Thomas shot back, the anger finally leaking out. You come into my shop, insult me, call me an extortionist, and try to buy your way out of feeling like a lousy parent. I didn't help her because of who you are. I didn't even know who you were. I helped her because she was a scared kid. Period. Madeline stood, frozen, her hand still holding the checkout, in the empty space between them. Nobody spoke to her like this. Nobody looked at her with pity and disgust. Put your checkbook away, Mrs. Moore, Thomas said, turning his back on her and picking up his broom. You don't owe me a dime, but you owe that kid a hell of an apology. Now, if you don't mind, I have actual paying customers to get to. He walked away, leaving the billionaire standing in the middle of his dirty shop, the $5,000 check trembling slightly in her hand. For the first time in a decade, Madeline Moore had absolutely nothing to say. The space heater gave out at 2:14 a.m. It didn't die quietly. It let out a sharp, pathetic crackle, spat a brief shower of orange sparks against the cracked linoleum of the office floor, and released a toxic little puff of ozone. Then silence. Thomas, who had been dozing in the rolling desk chair with his boots propped on a stack of unpaid invoices, jerked awake. The sudden absence of the heater's rattling fan left a void that the winter cold immediately rushed to fill. He sat up, his joints popping, and stared at the dead coil. He didn't try to fix it. He knew the smell of fried copper wire. He turned his head to look at the couch. Ben was curled into a tight ball beneath a threadbare sleeping bag, his breath pluming in faint, misty clouds under the glow of the street lamp bleeding through the window. The boy shifted a soft, involuntary shiver, racking his small shoulders. Thomas stood up. The concrete floor leached the heat straight through the rubber soles of his boots. He walked over to a stack of packing supplies in the corner, grabbed a thick, quilted moving blanket, smelling faintly of mildew and exhaust, and draped it carefully over his son. Ben let out a heavy sigh, burrowing deeper. Thomas walked back to his desk. He sat down and put his head in his hands. The grease under his fingernails looked like dried blood in the dim light. $5,000. The number echoed in the empty shop louder than the sleet now ticking against the corrugated tin roof. He had thrown away $5,000. For what a moral victory! To see the look of shock on a billionaire's face. The pride that had burned so hot in his chest that morning had entirely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, nauseating ash. It was a rich man's luxury pride. When you were starving, pride was just a decorative anchor dragging you to the bottom. He could have paid the back taxes. He could have replaced the main furnace. He could have bought Ben the heavy Columbia winter coat they'd looked at in the sporting goods store. The one Thomas had pretended was too bulky because he couldn't afford the $90 price tag. Instead, his kid was sleeping under a moving blanket in a freezing garage because his father wanted to feel like a man for 30 seconds. He felt a sudden violent urge to punch the wall. He wanted to shatter the drywall, to feel the splintering of the wooden studs against his already battered knuckles. He clenched his fists, his breathing going shallow and ragged. But he didn't swing. He just sat there, listening to the sleet, letting the self-loathing settle into his bones like a deep frost. The next 3 days were a masterclass in slow suffocation. The sleet turned to snow, burying the city under 4 inches of grey slush. The cold kept customers away. Nobody wanted to deal with a broken alternator when it was 12 degrees outside. Wade's auto was effectively a tomb. Thomas spent his hours pacing the bay, organizing wrenches that were already organized, trying to keep his blood moving. On Thursday afternoon, he was sitting on an overturned milk crate, staring blankly at a stripped transmission, when he heard the heavy, grinding roar of a diesel engine. He looked up. A massive, flatbed tow truck was backing into his lot, its yellow strobe lights painting the dirty snow in rhythmic, sickly flashes. Thomas stood up, his knees cracking. He hadn't called for a tow. The truck hissed to a halt. The hydraulic bed began to tilt upward with a mechanical whine. Chained to the bed was a car that made Thomas stop walking. It was a 1968 Chevrolet Chevelle SS. The paint was a faded, bruised purple, peeling at the fenders to reveal red primer. The chrome bumper was pitted with rust, and the driver's side window was rolled down an inch, letting the snow drift onto the vinyl interior. It looked heavy mean and completely dead. The tow truck driver hopped out of the cab, pulled a lever, and the winch began to slowly lower the heavy muscle car onto the slushy asphalt. A sleek black SUV pulled into the lot a moment later, stopping near the gas pumps. Thomas wiped his hands on his coveralls, his jaw tightening, as the driver's door of the SUV opened. It was Madeline Moore. She wasn't wearing a silk blouse today. She wore a heavy charcoal grey wool trench coat, the collar turned up against the biting wind. She wore leather gloves. She sidestepped a puddle of frozen slush, her eyes locked on Thomas. Thomas didn't move. He felt the phantom weight of the $5,000 check he had refused. His stomach twisted with a sickening mix of hunger and resentment. "Drop it right there," Madeline told the tow driver, her voice slicing through the cold air. She turned to Thomas. "Mr. Wade." Thomas shoved his hands into his pockets to hide the fact that they were trembling slightly from the cold. "Mrs. Moore, did your kid blow out another tire, or are you just here to audit my inventory again?" Madeline's face remained perfectly still. She walked up to the front of the Chevelle, trailing a gloved hand over the freezing metal of the hood. "This belonged to my father," she said, ignoring his tone. "It's been sitting in a climate-controlled warehouse for 9 years. I tried to have my usual fleet mechanic start it this morning. He told me the engine is seized, and it needs a complete modern crate engine swap. He said it would cost $30,000 and take 2 months. She turned to look at Thomas. Her pale eyes caught the flat grey light of the winter sky. "I don't want a modern engine in it," Madeline said. "I want the original block running. Can you do it or can't you?" Thomas looked at the car. He could smell it from here, the distinct, nauseating stench of varnish that used to be gasoline, the damp rot of old rubber, and the metallic tang of oxidized iron. It was a nightmare job. Every bolt would be rusted shut. The carburetor would be glued together with sludge. "Why bring it here?" Thomas asked, his voice low. "You can afford any restoration shop in the state. People who have heated floors and espresso machines in their waiting rooms. Because you were honest with me," Madeline said. It wasn't a compliment. She said it like a statement of clinical fact. "You were rude, abrasive, and unnecessarily hostile. But you didn't take my money when you could have. That implies a certain pathological integrity. I need someone who will actually fix the machine, not just charge me to replace it, because it's easier." She stepped closer. The smell of her perfumed cedar and something sharp mingled with the smell of the Chevelle's old exhaust. "I am not offering you a handout, Mr. Wade," she said, her voice dropping a fraction. "I am offering you a job, your standard shop rate, parts and labor. I require an itemized invoice. Do you want the work, or should I tell the driver to winch it back up?" Thomas looked at her. He wanted to tell her to go to hell. He wanted to maintain the high ground. Then he thought of Ben shivering under the moving blanket. Thomas uncrossed his arms. He walked past her, stepping up to the grille of the Chevelle. He popped the hood latch. It screamed in protest, but gave way. He hauled the heavy steel hood up. The engine bay was a disaster. Rat nests in the air, cleaner vacuum lines, dry rotted, and crumbling like burnt toast, the cast-iron intake manifold, covered in a thick layer of greasy orange rust. "Shop rate is $120 an hour," Thomas said to the engine block, not looking at her. "For a job like this with 9-year-old bad gas, I'm billing you a minimum of 20 hours just to tear down the top end, boil out the fuel tank and rebuild the carb. If the rings are fused to the cylinder walls, the price triples. And I need a $2,000 deposit for parts, right now. Non-negotiable." He waited for her to flinch, to haggle. "Fine," Madeline said. Thomas turned his head. She was already holding out a sleek, black metal credit card. He stared at the card. He reached out and took it. The metal was freezing. "Leave the keys," Thomas grunted. "I'll call you when I know how bad it is." The smell of carburetor cleaner is a violent thing. It doesn't just assault the nose. It burns the back of the throat and strips the moisture from the eyes. Thomas breathed it in deeply, a grim comfort in the familiarity. It was late Friday night. The shop was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of Thomas shaking a can of penetrating oil. The Chevelle was pushed into the center bay. It had taken Thomas and a neighboring forklift driver an hour just to roll the heavy dead weight inside. Now it sat under the harsh fluorescent lights, looking like a dissected corpse. Thomas wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with a rag that was entirely saturated with black grease. The heater was still broken, but he was sweating from pure agonizing exertion. He had spent the last 4 hours fighting with the intake manifold bolts. They had essentially welded themselves to the engine block over the last decade. He'd had to use a blowtorch to heat the cast iron, followed by a breaker bar, and every curse word he knew. He leaned over the fender, ignoring the sharp pain radiating down his lower back. He shone a flashlight down the throat of the 4-barrel Holly carburetor. It was worse than he thought. The fuel had turned into a solid, amber-colored resin. The floats were stuck fast. "Dad!" Thomas flinched, banging his elbow against the air cleaner stud. He hissed in pain, dropping the flashlight. It clattered into the fan shroud. He turned around. Ben was standing in the doorway of the office, holding his math textbook. He was wearing his winter hat indoors. "Hey, buddy," Thomas said, softening his voice instantly. He wiped his hands on his coveralls, leaving dark smears across his thighs. "What's up? You should be sleeping." "I don't understand the fractions," Ben said quietly, his eyes darting to the massive, terrifying car. "And it's cold in there." Thomas's heart gave a familiar, painful squeeze. He walked over, kneeling down so he was eye level with his son. He ignored the aching protest of his knees. "Bring the book out here," Thomas said. He pointed to a relatively clean wooden workbench near the toolboxes. "Sit up there. The halogen work lamps give off a little heat. We'll figure out the fractions together." Ben nodded, shuffling over to the bench. Thomas hoisted him up, setting him carefully next to a row of socket wrenches. For the next hour, the shop was filled with the quiet murmur of Thomas's voice, explaining common denominators, punctuated by the sharp scrape of a wire brush against rusted iron. Thomas worked with one hand, cleaning the manifold surface, while gesturing to Ben's notebook with the other. He didn't hear the side door open. The wind howled outside, masking the sound of the hinges. It wasn't until Thomas turned to grab a scraper that he saw her. Madeline Moore was standing inside the shop near the stack of bald tires. She was wearing a long black coat this time, her hands deep in the pockets. She was perfectly still watching them, watching Thomas explain math to his kid while bleeding from a knuckle he'd busted on a water pump housing. Thomas froze. His instinct was to bark at her for sneaking in to tell her insurance didn't cover billionaires wandering around active bays, but there was something in her posture that stopped him. She didn't look like an auditor right now. She looked hesitant. "Door was unlocked," Madeline said, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the wind rattling the tin roof. "Neighborhood like this, you shouldn't walk through unlocked doors," Thomas said gruffly. He tossed the wire brush onto the bench. "People around here shoot first." "I was in the area," she lied smoothly. She walked closer, her eyes fixing on the dissected engine of her father's car. "I wanted to see the progress." Thomas scoffed, wiping his hands. "It's been 36 hours. Progress is that I haven't set it on fire yet." He walked over to the car, grabbing his flashlight and illuminating the dark cavity where the carburetor used to be. "Look," he said. Madeline stepped up to the fender, leaning in. The smell of her perfume hit him again, an alien invader in his world of oil and rust. "The fuel turned to shellac. The tank in the back is rotting from the inside out. But the good news is the block isn't seized." Madeline looked at him, her pale eyes searching his face. "My mechanic swore it was seized." "Your mechanic is a parts replacer, not a mechanic," Thomas muttered. He grabbed a heavy wrench and tapped the massive harmonic balancer at the bottom of the engine. He probably put a wrench on this felt resistance and decided to quote you 30 grand. He didn't bother to pull the spark plugs and pour Marvel mystery oil down the cylinders to loosen the rings. I let it sit overnight, turned it over by hand this morning. The compression is low, but the pistons are moving. Madeline stared at the rusted metal, then back at Thomas. A strange, unreadable expression crossed her face. It was the closest thing to respect he had ever seen on someone wearing a coat that expensive. "So it will run?" she asked. "It'll run," Thomas said, "but it's going to fight me every inch of the way." "Excuse me," a small voice piped up. Madeline turned. Ben was peering at her from his perch on the workbench, his glasses reflecting the harsh work lights. "Are you the lady who owns the purple car?" Ben asked. Madeline looked at the boy. For a second, the severe, polished CEO vanished. She looked slightly lost, as if children were a foreign language she hadn't practiced in years. "I am," she said, her voice surprisingly soft. "My dad says purple is a bold choice for a muscle car," Ben said earnestly. "He said it means the person who bought it didn't care what anybody else thought." Thomas closed his eyes, praying for the floor to open up and swallow him. He'd muttered that to himself 2 hours ago, while wrestling with a stubborn fuel line. Madeline didn't get angry. A slow, genuine smile, small but real, touched the corners of her mouth. It changed her entire face, softening the sharp angles of her jaw. She looked back at Thomas. "He was right," she said quietly. "My father didn't care what anybody thought." "Neither do I." She pulled a thick white envelope from her coat pocket and set it on the fender of the Chevelle. "What's that?" Thomas asked his guard, instantly snapping back up. "I told you I don't want—" "It's a signed authorization form," Madeline interrupted sharply, the CEO returning. "For my logistics company's fleet maintenance, 40 delivery vans, brakes oil suspension work. We currently outsource to a corporate chain. I want to move the contract." Thomas stared at the envelope. His heart began to hammer, a heavy, erratic rhythm against his ribs. 40 vans. Consistent work. It was enough to save the shop. It was enough to hire a guy. It was heat. "Why?" Thomas asked, his voice raw. "Because I didn't rip you off on an engine block." Madeline looked at him, then glanced over at Ben, who was watching them with wide eyes. "Because," Madeline said, her voice dropping so only Thomas could hear, "I have spent my entire life surrounded by men in suits who would sell their own mothers for 1/10 of what I offered you yesterday. I trust people who know the value of $1. But I trust people who know the cost of their own pride even more." She didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked out of the shop, the heavy metal door clicking shut behind her, leaving Thomas staring at the white envelope, the smell of cedar perfume cutting through the suffocating scent of the garage. The pumice soap felt like crushed glass against Thomas's raw knuckles. He stood at the deep utility sink in the corner of the shop, violently scrubbing the deep-set grease from his skin. The water ran ice-cold, turning the thick orange paste into a dirty grey slurry that spiraled down the drain. He scrubbed until his skin burned, but the black lines in his fingerprints remained. They always did. The white envelope had sat unopened on his workbench for 2 days. When he finally signed the authorization form, his handwriting was cramped and jagged. It felt like signing a confession. By Monday morning, Wade's auto was unrecognizable. 4 white Ford Transit vans clogged the lot, stinking of stale cardboard, spilled energy drinks, and hot diesel. The corporate logo of Moore Logistics was plastered across their side panels in aggressive, blocky blue letters. The sudden influx of work was overwhelming. Thomas had to call in a favor from Miller, an older mechanic with a bad left knee and a worse attitude just to handle the brake jobs. The shop was loud now. The piercing, high-pitched whine of pneumatic impact wrenches echoed off the cinder-block walls, accompanied by the heavy metallic clatter of dropped rotors and the constant hiss of the air compressor kicking on. The old space heater was gone, replaced by a massive industrial propane blower that roared like a jet engine and actually made the shop sweat-inducingly warm. Ben didn't wear his winter coat indoors anymore. It was salvation. It was security. And Thomas hated how much it felt like he had been bought. He was under the dashboard of a transit van on Friday afternoon, fighting a wiring harness that smelled heavily of melted plastic when the Maybach rolled up to the bay doors. Thomas slid out his back, cracking against the cold concrete. He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag, and watched the rear doors open. Madeline stepped out first. She was wearing a tailored charcoal suit that looked sharp enough to draw blood. A second later, Catalina emerged from the opposite side. The teenager looked entirely different than the terrified girl in the rain. She was wearing an oversized black hoodie, her hands shoved deep into the pockets, her shoulders hunched up to her ears. She looked resentful, exhausted, and deeply embarrassed. Madeline marched her daughter into the shop, stepping over the thick black air hoses, snaking across the floor. "Mr. Wade," Madeline said, over the roar of the propane heater. She didn't offer a greeting, just got straight to the point. "My daughter has something to say to you." Thomas leaned against the fender of the van. He tossed the greasy rag onto his toolbox. He hated this. He hated forced, wealthy contrition. It always felt like a performance for the parents' benefit, not the victims. Catalina stared at the floor. The scuffed toe of her expensive sneaker dug into a patch of dried oil. "I'm sorry." She mumbled the words, practically falling out of her mouth and dying on the concrete. "For being irresponsible, and for making you work late." "Look at him when you apologize, Catalina." Madeline snapped her voice like a cracking whip. Catalina's head jerked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She hated being here. She hated Thomas for being the reason she was being humiliated. "I'm sorry," she repeated louder this time, her voice tight with suppressed anger. Thomas looked at the girl, then at the mother. Madeline stood rigid, playing the role of the strict, uncompromising matriarch perfectly. She wanted Thomas to nod, to accept the apology, to validate her parenting. Thomas walked over to his workbench. Sitting on the scarred wood was the valve cover for the Chevelle. It was a heavy piece of stamped steel, currently covered in 4 decades of flaking rust, baked-on oil sludge, and peeling orange paint. Thomas picked it up. He grabbed a heavy block of rough-grit sandpaper from a drawer. He walked back over and held them both out toward Catalina. Catalina stared at the rusty metal, recoiling slightly. "What is that?" "It's a valve cover," Thomas said, his voice completely flat. "Apologies are just noise, kid. If you actually feel bad about taking up my time the other night, you can give me some of yours. Scuff this down to bare metal, every inch of it." Madeline's eyes widened. "Mr. Wade, that isn't necessary. She is wearing—" "You brought her here to learn a lesson, right?" Thomas interrupted, not breaking eye contact with Catalina. "Or did you just bring her here so you could check a box on your moral ledger?" The shop went dead quiet. Even Miller had stopped running his impact wrench, pretending to inspect a brake pad while blatantly eavesdropping. Madeline's jaw tightened. A flash of genuine indignation sparked in her pale eyes, but she swallowed it down. She looked at her daughter. "Take it," Madeline told her. Catalina looked horrified. "Mom, it's disgusting. It smells like dead animals." "Take it, Catalina." With shaking hands, the teenager took the heavy steel cover and the sandpaper block. The rust immediately stained her pale fingers a dirty reddish brown. "Bench is over there," Thomas said, pointing to the back corner. Don't press too hard or you'll gouge the metal. Let the grit do the work." For the next 2 hours, the only sound coming from the back corner was the harsh, rhythmic scritch-scratch of sandpaper on steel. Thomas ignored her completely, diving back into the wiring harness of the van. When Catalina finally walked up to him, her hoodie was streaked with black grease, her knuckles were raw, and her face was smudged with orange dust. She held out the valve cover. It wasn't perfect, but the heavy rust was gone, revealing the dull grey shine of bare steel underneath. Thomas took it. He inspected it under the work light, running his calloused thumb over the metal. "Not bad," Thomas grunted. He tossed the sandpaper onto a cart. "Go wash your hands. Use the gritty soap by the sink, not the pink stuff in the bathroom. The pink stuff won't cut the grease." Catalina didn't say anything. She just nodded, walking toward the sink with a strange, quiet focus. Madeline stood by the Maybach, watching the entire exchange. When Thomas finally met her gaze, she didn't look angry anymore. She looked tired. She gave him a single, slow nod, then opened the car door. The smell of raw, uncombusted gasoline is sharp enough to wake the dead. It hung heavy in the air of the center bay, mixing with the sweet, sickening scent of fresh antifreeze and the chemical tang of curing engine paint. It had been 3 weeks. The Chevelle's engine block, now painted a brilliant factory-correct Chevy orange, sat nestled between the freshly blacked-out fender wells. A new 4-barrel carburetor sat on top of the intake manifold like a crown of cast aluminum and brass. It was 8 p.m. on a Thursday. The fleet vans were gone for the day. Miller had gone home. Ben was sitting in the office playing a video game on a used console Thomas had bought with the first week's invoice from Moore Logistics, and Madeline was standing next to the open driver's side door of the Chevelle. She had started showing up twice a week. At first, it was under the guise of auditing the fleet maintenance. She would ask clipped specific questions about brake pad wear and tire rotation schedules. But inevitably, she would gravitate toward the center bay, standing silently by the rusted purple fender, watching Thomas work. Tonight, she was wearing a heavy cashmere sweater and dark jeans. It was the most casual Thomas had ever seen her. "Battery is hooked up," Thomas said. He was leaning over the passenger side fender, a wrench in one hand, a plastic bottle of high-octane fuel in the other. "Fluids are topped off. We've got oil pressure from the priming tool." Madeline looked at the cracked black vinyl of the driver's seat. She reached out, running a gloved hand over the thin, hard plastic of the original steering wheel. "You want to do the honors?" Thomas asked. Madeline pulled her hand back, startled. "Me, no. I don't know how to. I wouldn't know if something sounded wrong." "It's just turning a key, Mrs. Moore," Thomas said. He walked around the front of the car, stopping next to her. "It's your dad's car. You should be the one to wake it up." She hesitated. For a moment, the impenetrable armor of the CEO completely dissolved. She looked at the cracked seat like it was a time machine she was terrified to step into. Slowly, she slid behind the wheel. The old springs creaked violently under her weight. Thomas leaned over the engine bay. He squirted a heavy dose of raw fuel straight down the throat of the carburetor. "All right," Thomas called out. "Push the gas pedal to the floor once to set the choke. Then turn the key and hold it." Madeline gripped the steering wheel. Her knuckles went white. She pumped the pedal. She turned the key. The heavy, high-torque starter engaged with a violent, grinding whine. Roar! The engine spun the belts, spinning in a blur of black rubber. But it didn't catch. "Stop!" Thomas yelled. Madeline let off the key. The silence rushed back in heavy and pregnant. "Is it broken?" she asked, her voice tight. "It's an old machine." "It's stubborn," Thomas muttered. He grabbed a half-inch wrench from his pocket, loosened the distributor hold-down bolt, and twisted the heavy metal cap a fraction of an inch, clockwise, advancing the ignition timing. It needs to remember how to breathe. Try it again. Madeline turned the key. Pow. A deafening backfire shot out of the carburetor, a jet of blue flame erupting 2 feet into the air. Madeline shrieked, throwing her arms up to shield her face. Thomas didn't flinch. He just reached over and slapped a heavy rag over the flame, smothering it instantly. A thick plume of white, acrid smoke rolled up toward the ceiling. "Don't stop!" Thomas yelled over the ringing in their ears. "Keep cranking!" Madeline's hands, shaking, twisted the key hard. Vroom! The engine caught. Because Thomas hadn't bolted the exhaust pipes to the cast-iron headers yet, the sound was apocalyptic. An unmuffled big-block V8 engine erupting in an enclosed cinder-block room is a physical assault. The noise hit them in the chest like a physical shock wave. The concrete floor vibrated aggressively against Thomas's boots. The dust on the ceiling rafters shook loose, raining down like dirty snow. It was loud, it was violent, and it was alive. Thomas rushed to the carburetor, manually pulling the throttle linkage back to keep the idle high. The engine smoothed out, settling into a deep, aggressive loping roar that shook the entire chassis of the car. He looked through the open windshield at Madeline. She still had both hands gripping the steering wheel. Her eyes were closed, and sitting there deafened by the roar of combusting gasoline and hot oil, the billionaire was crying. She wasn't sobbing. Just 2 silent tears, cutting through the thin layer of dust that had settled on her cheeks, reflecting the harsh glare of the work lights. Thomas let the engine run for 30 seconds, making sure the oil pressure gauge on his mechanical dial was steady before reaching in and twisting the distributor slightly to smooth the idle. Then he walked to the window and reached over her lap, turning the key off. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sharp, metallic tink, tink, tink of the cast-iron manifolds rapidly cooling. The smell of burning, curing paint and rich exhaust was suffocating. Madeline didn't move. She kept her hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead through the dirty windshield at the cracked plaster of the shop wall. "He was a roofer," she said. Her voice was incredibly quiet, almost swallowed by the ringing in their ears. Thomas grabbed a blue shop towel and wiped his hands. He didn't say anything. He just leaned against the doorframe. "Before the logistics company, before the money." Madeline continued, her voice trembling slightly. "He carried bundles of asphalt shingles up aluminum ladders in the July heat. When he came home, he smelled exactly like this place. Sweat Gojo hand cleaner and hot metal. He bought this car brand new in '68. He saved for 3 years. She finally turned to look at Thomas. The icy, commanding gaze was entirely gone. "When he died, I put it in a warehouse," she whispered. "I couldn't stand looking at it. I couldn't stand the smell of it. It reminded me that before I was a CEO, I was just a roofer's kid in a cheap house." She reached up and wiped the tears from her face, smudging a streak of black steering wheel grime across her cheekbone. She didn't seem to care. "You brought it back," she said, looking at the orange engine block ticking in the cooling air. "Thank you, Thomas." It was the first time she had used his first name. Thomas looked at the smear of grease on her face. He looked at the ruined, beautiful car. He felt the heavy, suffocating weight of his own resentment begin to crack just a little. "Don't thank me yet." Thomas grunted, his voice rough. "The transmission still leaks like a sieve, and the brakes are completely shot. It's going to cost you a fortune." Madeline let out a sound that was half scoff, half laugh. She stepped out of the car, the springs groaning one last time. "Just send me the invoice," she said. March arrived with a brutal wet cold that turned the city's snowbanks into towering mounds of grey, exhaust-stained ice. Inside Wade's auto, however, the climate had fundamentally changed. The new overhead gas furnace hummed a steady, vibrating bass note, pumping dry, aggressive heat into every corner of the concrete box. The shop smelled different now. The sharp, acrid scent of poverty, of freezing, breath-damp mold and desperation had been burned away, replaced by the heavy industrial aroma of bulk-order motor oil, hot brake rotors, and the burnt coffee Miller kept brewing in the office. Thomas was lying on his back under the Chevelle. He was wrestling with a stubborn transmission linkage grease bleeding into the cuffs of his thermal shirt. The heavy thud of the side door echoing over the furnace noise made him pause. He didn't roll out immediately. He just tightened his grip on his half-inch wrench and waited. A pair of expensive black leather boots stepped into his line of sight. Beside them, a pair of scuffed white sneakers. "Mr. Wade." Madeline's voice cut through the mechanical hum. Thomas sighed, dropped the wrench onto his chest, and kicked off the floor to roll the creeper out from under the heavy steel frame. He sat up, wiping a smear of transmission fluid from his jawline with the back of his wrist. Madeline was holding a heavy manila folder. Catalina stood next to her. The teenager wasn't hiding in an oversized hoodie today. She wore a simple jacket, her hands jammed in her pockets, looking around the noisy, bustling shop with a strange, quiet curiosity. She made eye contact with Thomas and gave a short, awkward nod. Thomas nodded back. "Morning." "Is it finished?" Madeline asked. She didn't look at the dented fenders or the peeling purple paint. She looked at the fresh black rubber of the new tires and the clean, bright steel of the exhaust pipes peeking out from under the rear bumper. "Mechanically, it's tight," Thomas said, standing up and stretching his lower back until it popped sharply. "New brakes, rebuilt suspension, new fuel lines. The engine is tuned. It runs rich, but that's how it was built to run. The paint is still falling off, and the seats are still cracked. I didn't touch the cosmetics. Like you asked." Madeline stepped closer to the driver's side door. "Will it make it to the highway?" "It'll make it to California if you keep oil in it." Thomas grunted. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the original worn brass keys on a plain steel ring. He held them out. "You want to drive it home?" Madeline looked at the keys. Then she looked at Thomas. "Not alone. You're coming with me. If it stalls in an intersection, I am not pushing 4,000 pounds of steel by myself." Thomas wanted to argue. He had a stack of work orders on his desk, and Miller was already glaring at him from across the bay. But he looked at Madeline's face. She wasn't giving a corporate command. She was nervous. "Fine," Thomas said. He turned to Catalina. "Office is warm. Ben is playing some racing game on the TV. Don't touch the thermostat." Catalina blinked, surprised by the direct instruction, then shrugged and walked toward the office. Thomas grabbed a heavy canvas jacket and slid into the passenger seat of the Chevelle. The old vinyl groaned under his weight. Madeline got in behind the wheel. She turned the key. The massive V8 engine roared to life, instantly settling into a deep, aggressive, loping idle that shook the floorboards. The smell of rich exhaust immediately filled the cabin, bypassing the old, dry, rotted weather, stripping around the doors. Madeline pulled the heavy column shifter down into drive. The transmission engaged with a hard, mechanical clunk. She feathered the gas pedal. The heavy car lurched forward, rolling out of the bay and into the biting March air. As they turned onto the industrial access road, Thomas watched her hands. She gripped the thin plastic steering wheel, tightly fighting the sloppy, over-assisted power steering of the late 60s. The suspension was stiff, transferring every crack and pothole of the ruined asphalt directly into their spines. It was loud. The wind howled through the gaps in the windows, the engine roared against the firewall, and the heavy tires hummed against the road. "Take a left at the light," Thomas yelled over the noise. "Get it on the on-ramp. You need to open it up to clear the carbon out of the cylinders." Madeline threw him a sideways glance, her pale eyes wide. She clicked the heavy chrome turn signal stalk. As they hit the curved on-ramp to the interstate, Madeline hesitated, her foot hovering lightly on the pedal. The heavy car wallowed slightly in the turn. "Put your foot in it," Thomas barked. "It's not a Maybach. You have to force it." Madeline gripped the wheel, gritted her teeth, and stomped the gas pedal to the floor. The secondary barrels of the carburetor dumped a massive wave of raw fuel into the manifold. The engine didn't just accelerate, it exploded. The rear tires broke traction for a violent, terrifying second, squealing against the cold pavement before catching. The heavy steel nose of the Chevelle lifted, pinning Thomas and Madeline back into the cracked vinyl seats. The noise was absolute. It was the mechanical scream of iron fire and air tearing down the highway. Thomas looked over. Madeline wasn't terrified anymore. Her jaw was unclenched, her eyes were fixed on the road ahead, and a wild, unpolished, massive smile broke across her face. The severe lines of the CEO vanished, completely blown away by the roaring wind and the smell of burning gasoline. She looked exactly like a roofer's daughter from the wrong side of the tracks finally going home. They pulled back into Wade's auto 20 minutes later. The Chevelle's engine was ticking loudly as it cooled, the metal expanding and contracting in the freezing air. The smell of hot brakes and burning oil radiated off the hood, mingling with the crisp winter wind. Madeline put the car in park and shut the engine off. The sudden silence in the cabin was heavy, leaving a dull ringing in Thomas's ears. For a long minute, neither of them moved. Madeline kept her hands resting lightly on the bottom of the steering wheel. She traced the deep cracks in the plastic with her thumb. "It drives terribly," she said, her voice quiet in the cold cabin. "The steering is vague, the brakes are terrifying, and it smells like a refinery." "Yeah," Thomas said, leaning his head back against the flat headrest. "It's perfect." Madeline turned her head to look at him. The wild smile from the highway was gone, replaced by a quiet, grounded calm. "My father drove me to my high school graduation in this car," she said softly. "I was so embarrassed. All the other girls were getting out of town cars and limousines, and I climbed out of a loud, vibrating muscle car that smelled like exhaust. I hated him for it." She swallowed hard, staring at the rusty dashboard. "I would give everything I own to smell that exhaust with him one more time." Thomas looked out the dirty windshield at his shop. He saw the fleet vans lined up. He saw the warm glow of the office lights, where his son was safe, fed, and warm. "We don't get the time back," Thomas said, roughly, his voice grating like sandpaper. "We just get to keep the things they left behind, and try not to let them rot." Madeline nodded slowly. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the thick manila folder she had brought with her. She handed it across the console. Thomas took it. His heavily calloused fingers left faint dark smudges on the pristine paper. He opened it. Inside was a cashier's check. It wasn't for the engine rebuild. It was for the 20 hours he'd originally quoted, plus the suspension, the brakes, the fuel lines, and a massive markup for rush labor. It was enough to clear his remaining debt entirely. Behind the check was a printed contract. It was a 3-year exclusivity agreement for more logistics fleet maintenance. Thomas stared at the numbers. His chest felt incredibly tight, a heavy knot of disbelief and relief fighting for space in his throat. He looked up at her. "You don't need a 3-year lock," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "You could get a better bulk rate from a corporate chain." "I don't want a corporate chain," Madeline said. She opened her door, the cold air rushing in. She stepped out onto the concrete and looked down at him through the open frame. "I want a mechanic who looks at a broken, discarded thing and decides it's worth the blood to fix it. Keep the car running, Thomas. Keep my fleet on the road." She shut the door. The heavy latch clicked solidly into place. Thomas watched her walk toward the office. A minute later, she and Catalina emerged. The teenager actually looked back at the Chevelle, lingering for a second, before following her mother to the Maybach, idling near the street. Thomas sat in the cold car for a long time. He held the manila folder in his lap. He looked at his hands. The grease was still there, settled deep into the heavy lifelines of his palms. It would never wash out. But for the first time in years, his hands didn't feel heavy. They just felt like hands. He opened the door, stepped out into the biting March wind, and walked into his shop. The propane furnace roared loudly. He walked into the office. Ben was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a fresh blanket, aggressively mashing buttons on a controller. "Hey," Thomas said, leaning against the doorframe. Ben paused the game and looked up. "Did the loud car leave?" "Yeah, buddy," Thomas said, a slow, tired smile finally breaking through the grime on his face. "It's gone. Come on. Shut the game off. I'm closing the bay doors. We're going to get steak for dinner." Ben's eyes widened. "Real steak. Not the chopped kind." "Real steak," Thomas said. He folded the cashier's check, slipped it into his breast pocket, and tapped it once. "The biggest one they have." Thomas proved that true value isn't determined by a bank account. It's measured by the grit in your hands and the strength of your spine. Sometimes the hardest thing you can do is refuse to compromise who you are, even when you're starving. If you loved this story of redemption pride and the raw power of standing your ground, hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that integrity still matters, and don't forget to subscribe for more deeply human stories. What would you have done with the check? Comment below.